You're not really a doctor. You look too soft for actual medicine. Russell Bennett's voice cut through the subdivision's HOA meeting like he'd been waiting all year for the moment to say it. And maybe he had. I was sitting in a folding chair in the community center's fluorescent-lit conference room, watching him pace back and forth in front of the gathered neighbors like he owned the room, which, in his mind, he probably did. I mean, come on. Dr. Mercer, was it? With all due respect, you don't exactly scream surgeon. You should see my wife's neurologist. Now that guy looks like he knows what he's doing. This one just looks like she teaches yoga or something. The assembled neighbors laughed politely. They always did. Russell Bennett was the kind of man who commanded attention through sheer volume and confidence. The kind of man who could convince people that his opinions were facts simply through the force of his personality. I'd learned long ago that there was no point arguing with men like that. Instead, I just sat quietly and drank my coffee. His wife, Patricia, was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Recognition, maybe. Or curiosity. She reached over and grabbed my arm, her fingers pressing into my skin with sudden urgency, and whispered something to Russell that I couldn't hear. Russell's face went through a series of transformations. First confusion, then something that looked like comprehension, then absolute, unmistakable horror. "That's Dr. Mercer?" Patricia said, louder now, her voice carrying across the room. "Russell, that's Dr. Mercer? The surgeon who performed your transplant last year." The room went absolutely silent. Russell Bennett had suffered a massive cardiac event 14 months ago. He'd been a patient at Massachusetts General Hospital, where I worked as one of the leading cardiac surgeons in the Northeast. His case had been complicated: enlarged heart, advanced valve disease, the kind of condition that required not just technical skill, but the kind of intuitive understanding of cardiac pathology that you couldn't teach in medical school. He'd been on the transplant list for 6 months. I'd told him, during our consultations, that his condition was deteriorating faster than we'd expected. I'd told him that when a donor heart became available, we would need to move quickly. I'd told him, in the careful way doctors tell people things they're already terrified of, that there was no guarantee we would have time. When the call came at 3 a.m., I was already at the hospital. A compatible donor had been identified. Russell's window was narrow. The surgery would take 8 hours if everything went perfectly. 12 hours if there were complications. There were complications. His chest cavity had too much scar tissue from previous surgeries. The inferior vena cava had an anomaly that made access difficult. His pulmonary artery was positioned abnormally. Every single thing that could make the procedure harder was present. But I'd done it anyway. I'd spent 12 hours in an operating room, standing beside his body, my hands inside his chest, making decisions that would determine whether he lived or died. I'd removed his failing heart and implanted a new one. I'd sutured vessels with a precision that came from 15 years of training and 1,200 successful transplants. He'd woken up in the ICU 48 hours later. His wife had cried. His daughter had hugged me. He'd looked at me with gratitude so profound that I'd had to excuse myself from the room to maintain professional composure. 3 weeks later, when his recovery was progressing normally, he'd asked someone for my name so he could send a thank you card. He'd never sent it. Now, sitting in this HOA meeting in a subdivision we'd both coincidentally moved to in the same year, Russell Bennett was staring at me with the expression of a man who'd just realized something fundamentally wrong with his understanding of the world. "Aye, that was you," he stammered. "It was," I said simply. I set down my coffee cup and waited for what came next. "But you were." He looked around the room, clearly trying to reconcile the woman sitting in a folding chair wearing jeans and a cardigan with the surgeon who'd saved his life. "You were in the hospital. You did my surgery." "Yes," I said. "I did. You're a cardiac surgeon. One of the leading ones in New England, actually," I said. "Board certified. Fellowship trained. Approximately 1,200 successful heart transplants over my career. Your transplant was one of them." The room was still completely silent. I could see people recalibrating their opinions of me in real time. The woman who teaches yoga had just become the woman who saves lives. Russell's face was flushed. Patricia's grip on his arm had tightened. "I didn't know that was you," Russell said quietly. "I'm aware," I replied. "You've lived 3 houses away from me for 14 months. You see me in my driveway at least once a week. You've watched me come home from surgery at midnight still wearing scrubs. You've watched me walk in my yard on the rare days I have off. And you chose to believe that I couldn't possibly be a real doctor, because I don't fit your image of what a surgeon is supposed to look like. I didn't mean. Yes, you did, I interrupted. You absolutely meant it. You chose to mock me in front of all these people because my appearance didn't match your preconceived notions about medicine. You did it confidently, publicly, without any concern that you might be wrong. That's not an accident. That's just who you are. I'd become used to this a long time ago. The assumption that a woman in medicine must be a nurse. The shock when people realized I was a doctor. The particular kind of doubt that men like Russell directed at me. Doubt that seemed to stem from the fact that I was soft-spoken, relatively feminine in appearance, and apparently not the right shape for saving lives. When I was a medical student, my anatomy professor had suggested I might be better suited to primary care. When I was a resident, senior surgeons had questioned whether I had the killer instinct needed for cardiac surgery. When I'd applied for a fellowship at Mass General, one interviewer had asked if I was planning to have children, and whether that might distract me from the demanding nature of cardiac surgery. I'd answered that question by becoming one of their most celebrated surgeons. But I'd also learned to keep a certain invisibility about myself outside of work. I didn't attend many neighborhood events. I didn't tell people at parties what I did. I preferred to move through my personal life without the kind of scrutiny that came with the title cardiac surgeon. It made life simpler. It made people like Russell Bennett comfortable mocking me without consequence. Until now. Your transplant had significant complications, I said, standing up and addressing the room. I wasn't angry exactly. I was something colder than anger. Your cardiac anatomy was abnormal in 3 separate ways. Any one of those abnormalities would have made a standard transplant procedure extremely difficult. All 3 together meant that the procedure had approximately a 30% success rate. The room was completely still. Everyone was watching me now. You survived because I had the skill to navigate those complications. You survived because I'd done this exact procedure successfully over 1,000 times. You survived because your wife called an ambulance when you had your cardiac event, and because the donor match came through in time, and because your body accepted the new heart. And you survived because you were lucky. I paused. But mostly you survived because I'm a very good surgeon, I finished. Not because I look a certain way. Not because I dress a certain way. Not because I fit into Russell Bennett's preconceived notion of what a cardiac surgeon should look like. You survived because of my skill. I didn't mean to insult you, Russell said, his voice small now. I know you didn't, I said. You didn't think it was possible that I could be insulted. You didn't think it was possible that you were mocking someone whose hands had literally been inside your chest, keeping you alive. You didn't think that far ahead. You were just comfortable enough in your assumption that my appearance meant I couldn't possibly be what I claimed to be. Patricia had tears streaming down her face now. She understood. She understood what I was saying. She understood that her husband was alive because of this woman, and he'd just spent 6 months mocking her appearance. What I'm going to say next is important, I continued, looking directly at Russell. You don't get to apologize. You don't get to feel guilty and have that wash away what you just did. You're going to live with the knowledge that you mocked the woman who saved your life. You're going to remember this conversation every time you see me. You're going to think about it every time you're grateful to be alive. And that discomfort, that awareness of your own error, that's actually deserved. I walked out of the HOA meeting without waiting for a response. Behind me, I could hear Russell's voice, small and broken, trying to explain something that couldn't be explained away. The next morning, there was a formal apology letter left on my doorstep. It was handwritten, careful, the kind of letter that took a long time to write. Russell had tried to explain his assumptions. He'd tried to articulate why he'd made the comments he had. He'd tried to express his gratitude and his shame. I threw it away without finishing it. I didn't throw it away because I was cruel. I threw it away because I didn't need his apology. His apology was for him, not for me. His apology was him trying to feel better about the fact that he'd been wrong. I already knew he was wrong. 3 weeks later, I was called to emergency surgery. A patient had suffered a severe aortic dissection, a life-threatening condition where the inner layer of the aorta tears. The window for successful intervention was measured in hours, not days. I was in the operating room by 11 p.m. The patient was a man in his mid-50s, already in shock, his blood pressure dangerously low. The dissection was extensive. The prognosis was grim. But I was very good at what I did. I spent 11 hours replacing the damaged section of the aorta with a synthetic graft. I repaired the compromised coronary arteries. I managed his bleeding, his cardiac function, his physiology with the kind of precise attention that came from years of training. He survived. When his family came to see me afterward, they thanked me. They cried. They told me I was a hero. I accepted their gratitude professionally, knowing that what I did wasn't heroic. It was just my job. It was what I'd trained for. It was what I was good at. But Russell Bennett would never understand that. He would never understand that saving lives was just my Tuesday. That what seemed miraculous to him was routine for me. And that was the real gap between us. Not in appearance or gender or any of the superficial things he'd been focused on. It was the gap between someone who understood the reality of medicine and someone who saw it through the lens of television and assumption. I never saw Russell Bennett at another HOA meeting. Apparently, his wife had asked him to stop attending. I saw him in his driveway occasionally, and I watched him physically tense when he saw me. He'd wave sometimes, a small, guilty gesture that I never acknowledged. That was fine. I didn't need acknowledgement. I didn't need his recognition or his gratitude. What I had was something more valuable, the knowledge that I'd saved his life. That every day he woke up and drew breath, it was because of me. That when he felt his heart beating normally, it was because I'd put a new heart inside his chest and kept him alive through the complications. That was enough. At the hospital, I continued doing what I'd always done. I saved lives. I trained residents. I published research on cardiac pathology. I mentored young female surgeons who were just beginning to navigate a field that still doubted them because they didn't look the part. I told them what I'd learned a long time ago. That confidence in your skill was the only validation that mattered. That the opinions of people like Russell Bennett were irrelevant. That women didn't need to look a certain way to be surgeons. They just needed to be good enough. I was good enough. And in the end, that was the only thing that mattered. 6 months after the HOA meeting, I was promoted to Chief of Cardiac Surgery at Mass General. It was the highest position in my field at one of the most prestigious hospitals in the country. Only 5 women had held this position in the hospital's entire history. I celebrated quietly, alone in my apartment, knowing that this promotion was the culmination of 15 years of work, 1,200 successful transplants, and the kind of dedication that left no room for people like Russell Bennett. Sometimes I thought about that HOA meeting, about the moment when his wife realized who I was, about the horror on his face when he understood that he'd just mocked the woman who'd saved his life. But I didn't think about it with satisfaction or vindication. I thought about it as a simple fact. He'd been wrong about me. And that wrongness would follow him for the rest of his life, a small shadow of regret that he'd carry with him. It was the kind of consequence that didn't require anger or revenge. It was just the natural result of underestimating someone based on appearance. And in the quiet moments when I was alone, remembering that, I found something that felt almost like peace. Because the truth was simple. I was a doctor. A very good one. And no amount of mockery from Russell Bennett or anyone like him could change that fundamental fact. I'd saved his life. And that meant something that transcended his opinion of how a surgeon should look. It meant I was exactly what I'd always claimed to be.